Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome to Quotidiano TV here on my weekly talk show Compass. Today with a very special guest with Professor Rudolph Castellani. Mr. Professor Castellani, welcome to Quotidiano TV. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine.
It's a great honor to host you in my interview today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Professor Castellani. He received his MD from the Wayne State University. He completed anatomic pathology residency at Wayne State University and a neuropathology fellowship at Case Western Reserve University. He was a formerly tenured professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine, and has directed neuropathology divisions at the University of Maryland Medical Center, Western Michigan University, Homer Stryker Medical School of Medicine, and West Virginia University before accepting a position as a professor of pathology at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in 2021. Professor, welcome here on Compass TV. Today, we will talk also about some medical historical aspects of neuropathology, since yes. I think history and a historical understanding of some very old cases might be useful for better understanding of some disease nowadays.
Sounds good. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Professor, first of all, we all heard about, well, mainly physicians, the Creutzfeldt, the famous prion disease, the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Yes. But maybe the first case of Dr. Creutzfeldt, Mrs. Bertha Elschker, they first met when she was like 22 years old. Right. She was hospitalized at the clinic where Creutzfeldt worked 1913 with a very rapidly deteriorating mental condition and neurological disorders. And this was actually the first case. What is so special about this first case? But at the same time, why is it so controversial?
Well, I mean, I guess it's special because it carries the namesake of the disease that we now call Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So on the surface, it was the original description of a disease that we now know as CJD. And over time, as we've discussed, the word prion has been invoked. And it's a very fascinating disease. And actually, even prior to that case, there was a related condition in sheep called scrapie that was known to be transmissible among the flocks, and we now know it's a very closely related condition. And the pathology of that disease was actually known in the late 19th century. But the original case was a progressive neurological deterioration in a 22-year-old woman. Now, the fact that the person was 22 and they became symptomatic makes the diagnosis of modern CJD highly unlikely. The disease is generally a disease of middle-aged and older individuals, sometimes people in their 30s, almost never in people in their early 20s. So already it's kind of suspect. I think in some of the more recent cases that have been linked to bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease, some of those individuals did tend to be younger individuals, but that's really a distinct condition. What we think of as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease or sporadic CJD, a 22-year-old person is very unusual. She did suffer progressive neurologic decline over a period of over a relatively short period, which raises the issue of prion disease. But the translation that I've seen, and I went back and translated the article myself as best I could with Google Translate basically, and the pathological description, the neuropathological description provided by Creutzfeldt does not line up at all with what we call CJD today. So I think it's abundantly clear from the standpoint of basic concept, how we understand the disease today. The initial case by Creutzfeldt was not a case of CJD. We retain the name.
Nevertheless, he was one of the most talented neuropathologists of the 20th century and a true scientist devoted to his profession. But
yes,
then,
and there are other. His name is attached to another type of like what we call the Creutzfeldt cell, and yes, he worked with Alzheimer back in the days when there's a lot of initial basic anatomical observations were being made, and so yes, he's a genuine leader. But that doesn't mean that. And to his credit, I think if I understand the paper correctly, he really didn't draw too many conclusions about what the disease was or how it should be classified. He just described a case. It was unusual. It said, here it is. We'll put it out in the literature and we'll see what you think. And over time, it was attached to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Now, Jakob had described, I think, 5 other cases not long after that. And from my reading of the history, perhaps 2 out of 5 would fit with what we call CJD today. So they weren't drawing too many conclusions. They were identifying a disease process. They put it out in the literature for consumption by the medical community, and see what happens. But that is probably not the only time that the initial description of a particular disease process turned out to be something else.
But later on, like 80 years later, in case of variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, there is again a situation where we have a resemblance, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So 80 years later, his first case made him deserving the later name of the disease, at least from a historical point of view. Comparing it to nowadays findings with the first cases in the middle of the 90s of the variant CJD, there we have similar aspects again with his first case.
Similar in terms of age, of onset, but not similar in terms of what they're describing under the microscope pathologically.
But what they have observed, if you were to read this report without knowing the author, what would you say? What was the disease Mrs. Elschker was suffering of?
It reads like a case of some type of encephalitis. So I would say it's either immune-mediated encephalitis or an infectious encephalitis, such as a virus. That's what it seems to resemble based on the description. They describe proliferations of a particular cell type called microglia and microglial stars and so forth. That's generally evidence of an immune-mediated process. So now we often have trouble even today, just figuring out what the true cause is of something that looks like it's immune-mediated. We see this on a regular basis, actually, in my neuropathology practice. Somebody presents with some progressive neurological deterioration. You get a biopsy. A surgeon will send you some tissue. You see inflammation, but you don't have a specific cause. So again, if the description reads like an immune-mediated process, either autoimmune or viral. That would be my best guess based on my reading of the translation.
That's very interesting because particularly 1913, that was from a time horizon not very far away from the appearance of another neurodegenerative disease of the Encephalitis Lethargica.
Right.
While 1917, 1913, maybe somewhere around the corner.
Yeah.
A couple of years later.
Well, and even in Encephalitis Lethargica, also it's an interesting read. If you go back and study Encephalitis Lethargica with a sort of I don't want to say modern day, but with how we understand diseases now, there's not a lot of information on that. I mean, we assume that it's I think like a post-viral neurodegenerative disease. Such conditions are extraordinarily rare, and it's conflated with things like Parkinson's disease, sporadic Parkinson's disease, juvenile Parkinson's disease. So when it comes to these nervous system diseases, they are very complex, and they raise a lot of possibilities. You know, looking at literature over 100 years ago, it's almost like engaging in anthropology, because the language is different, the techniques are different, you know, the evidence base is different. So it is a fascinating area, though, and the early part of the 20th century was really the time when there was sort of a proliferation of microscopic anatomical observations. So there was quite a lot of literature, particularly from Germany, on nervous system diseases. So we're just beginning to understand these disease processes, anatomically speaking.
I don't know if in my invitation I've sent you also a description written by Professor Peter Passeau from 1919, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And there he also makes a pathological description of encephalitis lethargica. Now my question would be, might Mrs. Elschker be at a certain extent possibly a case of encephalitis lethargica?
Yeah, I think it's possible insofar as the encephalitis lethargica is understood, which I don't think is that well understood. I think possible, but I think that I would hesitate to draw any firm conclusions or firm diagnosis.
Fully understand, yeah.
It's you know, encephalitis lethargica is of interest to neuropathologists because it has a component of it that, well, it's a chronic disease, and it leaves behind a neurodegenerative process. You know, it leaves behind protein accumulation somehow, and so that's always of interest to groups and individuals and institutions that are studying other diseases like Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, other so-called tauopathies, to see, because if you think about it, what we call now prion diseases and encephalitis lethargica possibly are really the only two conditions that could be described as neurodegenerative that have an environmental cause, possibly a third, and that is measles virus. But it's really very difficult to find an environmental cause to these disease processes, and encephalitis lethargica is potentially one, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is potentially another. So you're really getting into very exotic and very interesting diseases.
Well, surprisingly, reading, for myself, I'm not a specialist in this area at all, but reading older medical reports and analysis, it's like a whole adventure. It must have been also an adventure for scientists back then, because they describe the way the disease they have observed could be transmitted and ways it could not be transmitted.
Right.
And they were fully aware that the transmission pathway differs completely from the transmission of other viruses or bacteria. So that was quite a mysterious disease in their perception already, and it remained mysterious till nowadays. And still experts nowadays do compare at a certain extent, certainly COVID-19 with encephalitis lethargica, although, as you truly mentioned, the vocabulary is a different one. The techniques are different, but some comparison is nevertheless made.
Right. So-called slow COVID and so forth. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So funny, in an article written by, we'll come back to Elschker, but in an article written by Professor Bramwell, 1923, he's quoting other scientists, Levaditi and Javier, also affirm that the disease can be transmitted by the mucosa of the nose after the latter has been irritated by croton oil. I must admit that I never heard of croton oil before. I was Googling croton oil, and then I saw that this oil is being made out of seeds of a plant, and that this oil had been advertised for during the Russian flu between 1889 and 1992, which is again then later compared to Encephalitis Lethargica and Spanish flu, and compared to nowadays to COVID. And I started thinking, now surprisingly, Bramwell is also looking at the possible pathway of infection with this unusual pathogen agent by microlesions of the nasal epithelial cells. Then we have the croton oil. And then I asked myself, well, that's funny. People in the late 19th century thought, also with the carbolic oil smoke ball, that inhaling this oil would stop them from getting sick. One of the most famous cases in contract law is the carbolic smoke ball, which was sold during the time of the Russian flu. But apparently this oil produced some lesions of the mucosa, which made them susceptible to a virus which nobody knows.
It's fascinating. I had not heard that. That's fascinating.
I'll send you the by mail. It's a publication from 1921 about Encephalitis Lethargica, written by Professor Bramwell and by Professor Thomas Betty, the president of the section of the medicine in the discussion on Encephalitis Lethargica. So it's absolutely fascinating to see all these connections, what the clinicians those days have observed. They had like Creutzfeldt, an extremely well-trained observation capacity. I don't know if we encounter this observation capacity till nowadays.
Well, again, at that particular time, the idea of clinical pathological correlation was just beginning, and so there's a lot of time and attention devoted to specific clinical details and specific pathological details, and bringing those two things together. And so that was the focus. In fact, if you look at the medical literature from this era compared to now, you often find more details in the classical literature than appear now. And you look at a paper now, you want to see more, but they tend to leave more out. So that's what I mean. Basically, the practice of science is really a challenge between theory and observation. And so the more detailed you are in your observations, the more you can challenge the scientific mode of inquiry and perhaps come to some conclusions. But it's always a work in progress. I mean, I'd say there's nothing new under the sun. I think people struggled to understand things then, and we struggle to understand things now. In a sense, probably the advent of molecular biology and the mass proliferation of basically information. In fact, that you could take somebody's mucosa and sequence the entire human genome virtually overnight, I think provides us with a lot of information, but basic understanding is still kind of limited in many respects. I would say that 100 years ago they didn't get everything right, probably, just like Creutzfeldt. But I think that, as I said earlier, it was the first time where that in the history of medicine where there was really detailed examination of clinical pathological correlations, and so many observations were being recorded for study and correlation. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, also, I fully understand what you're saying, your point. But is it also possible that sometimes a certain knowledge or a certain wisdom simply, it's put like aside. It's not getting away, it's not getting lost, but a book, maybe some of you, ladies and gentlemen, at least have seen the movie Time of Awakening. Professor Sachs is saying that a sort of mysterious disease referring to Encephalitis Lethargica had taken place every couple of centuries, and that scientists seem to forget about it, that they almost start from zero when dealing again with such a disease. How is it possible that in let's say, in case of medicine, that certain scientific progress gets forgotten about, or at least a new generation of experts isn't, not criticizing them, but at least they are not aware of it? Is it just too much stuff and too many studies which a young physician is unable to study, or even a scientist, because too much information had been published?
Well, I think that's certainly an issue. I mean,
it's an overload of information.
Things do tend, very basic things, I think, do tend to get forgotten, or you have the idea, or instead you have the illusion that you do understand it, but really don't, and you sort of gloss it over. But yeah, I mean, the medical literature, of course, has expanded exponentially. So I mean, nobody could keep track of everything. There's just way too much, and the journals that are out there, are in the business of publishing, and they need to publish, and academics need to publish to maintain their credentials and maintain their basically their place in the field. So as a result, there's just enormous literature, and it's, so I would say there's a lot of literature, but not necessarily knowledge, because it still has to be synthesized. And I think what you said earlier, that things, the basic concepts tend to get forgotten. I think that's true. I mean, I think we're all guilty of that. But I would say medical knowledge has not increased in congruous to the literature. The literature's gone up like this, and now advancements in science is more like flat, or maybe slight uptick. So it's a lot to keep track of, and modern molecular biology is enormously complicated, and we just down the hall from me, in my institution, we have our molecular pathology division, where we're doing all sorts of high throughput molecular analysis, for example, of brain tumors that I deal with every day, and I have a hard time keeping up with it. and it's right next door. So, and there's always new papers coming out. So these are very, very interesting times. And I think a little bit of humility is in order with when it comes to modern medical practice, medical science. There's a lot of information out there, but as I said, medical knowledge still has some work to do, and it always will, I suspect, right? So science is really not, it's not a destination. It's a set of concepts that are constantly evolving, and that's taking place now, just as it did 100 years ago.
Yeah, that may be one part of the guilt, and the other one is like creating a sometimes wrong history, put it like that, particularly in the case of another famous scientist, Gajdusek, though he was not a neuropathologist, but I think his neuropathological knowledge was maybe very, very advanced.
Right.
And Gajdusek is perceived as a scientist who investigated a disease of cannibals, although he did not believe that the transmission of Kuru is linked to the gut or to eating human flesh. From his correspondence, and that was such for me, such an adventurous literature to read his correspondence. Yeah. He was aware that that lesions of the nose contribute to the transmission of the disease, that maybe the indigenous population were in contact with their hands with contaminated proteins, but finally the lesions of the nasal epithelial cells allowed these cells entering the body. And it's a certain extent a sort of injustice, always talking about Gajdusek, about a scientist who did research on a cannibal disease, because it's not just that the medical literature is writing like that about him, it's also anthropologists who went to Papua, although they were not specialists in the field of medicine.
Right.
Surprisingly, they were investigating cannibalism. And I don't understand why. For me, as a person outside of the box, it looks like a mainstream should believe that such a disease is taking the gastrointestinal passage, and will not take any other passage while entering the body. It simply does not make sense why a whole army of anthropologists wrote a story which, from the point of view of the scientists who discovered it, makes no sense.
Yeah, and I would also...
How could we reconcile this conflictual situation? None of them are present in the dialogue to defend themselves.
Yeah, I think it's interesting studying these things, and the idea of cannibalism has sort of an exotic quality to it. But my understanding is that they really refer to it as endocannibalism, where it was really more a rite of respect from the Foray Highlanders in Papua New Guinea. It was not a aggressive form of warfare where you're engaging it. So it was sort of a rite of respect, and there was poorly understood exactly. It was kind of known, I think, that the disease was more prevalent in younger people and in women and less in men, and it took some time to understand that. There were some issues of perhaps being a familial condition. And yes, there's the process of preparing the deceased leads to breakdown in tissues, as you mentioned, in the nasal mucosa that could transmit the disease, rather than simply the ingestion of tissue. And my understanding is that the brain was not a big part of that process. It may have been, but my understanding that it was not.
Brain homogenate could be used to transmit the disease from humans to monkeys or other animals.
But I think the whole the cannibalism is it appeals to the exotic nature of it. But what's really interesting now is that a very closely related condition that we started out at the beginning, called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And I would, let's say 99% of the cases, you can't really identify an infectious cause. They're either what we call sporadic or in some cases familial. So only in rare conditions in humans do we have what we call iatrogenic CJD, where you're getting it from some environmental contaminant. And the major source of that is pituitary growth hormone injections. And then in a small number of individuals who had the variant that CJD, vast majority are sporadic or familial, and those are much more in line with other types of neurodegenerative diseases. But I'm not privy to all the discussion or what the anthropologists are saying about this. I haven't studied that in great detail. I know Gajdusek made some very important observations. He dedicated his life basically to studying a group of people in New Guinea, and they came across a very unusual nervous system condition, and they got to the bottom of it. Took a few years, but they so I think it's to their credit. A guy like Gajdusek, who's really a brilliant, genius type of individual, could have done anything he wanted to do in the United States. He chose to go to live among the 4A Highlanders in Papua New Guinea to study the disease. So there's a level of dedication there. I think that is commendable.
Do you think that his concept of a slow virus was replaced, and that it will stay like that, by the concept of the prion? Is that the way? Is that the fate of scientists, or could we observe at a later stage in future that there might be a slow virus and not a prion?
Well, yeah, these are interesting questions, and people have obviously.
It's the last question I ask you, so I apologize for that.
No, it's something that's been discussed. The idea of a slow virus, like what is a slow virus exactly? The nearest one can come to among known viruses is really the measles virus. Certain mutated measles viruses will produce a progressive degenerative disease, usually in children. So whether prion diseases are viral in etiology, I personally tend to doubt it. Just my own view of the matter. But at the same time, what the role of the prion protein, I think, is a work in progress. I don't think it is established, in my opinion, with certainty that this protein drives the disease process and causes it. I think it's a part of the disease process. I think it travels with the disease process, so to speak. But whether it's the cause or whether it is the infectious agent, I think is not determined with certainty. Certainly, Prusner's work tended along those lines, and he's a strong proponent of the prion theory, the prion concept. But we still don't know with scientific certainty whether this prion protein travels with the disease, goes along with it, or drives the disease. That's a very important distinction. And we just don't have the answer to that question, in my opinion. Whether a virus, possibly, but I tend to doubt a conventional virus.
Like one of Guy Dusek's articles, a fantasy of a virus from the unorganic world. Maybe something like that, but we don't know yet which virus it might be.
Right, exactly right. I think everything's on the table at this point, in my opinion. Yeah.
Hope so.
Yeah.
We hope so that having everything on the table facilitates at least very transparent research, even in areas which could maybe unlock some secrets of past disease, and then submit also a better explanation for present and prevent the risks of future disease.
Right. And who knows, maybe an advance along these lines will translate to an advance and possibly related conditions. So you never know. But yes, transparency is important. And some of these concepts that you mentioned get into some controversy, and people get into their entrenched schools of thought, and they tend to view their school of thought as a little bit more enlightened. And if you disagree, then you're less enlightened. But transparency and open and honest dialogue is obviously critical. I mean, that's what science is all about, really. It's about intellectual honesty.
Professor Castellani, thank you very much for this great interview. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a unique opportunity to listen to some actually most interesting aspects of neuropathology in a historical perspective, and also for the physicians among you, ladies and gentlemen, who have watched this interview. A simple way to motivate you to deal again with the history of medicine and neuropathology. Professor, thank you very much for having joined me, and best greetings to Chicago.
It's a great honor and my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you.